It was, as Lord Peter Wimsey would later remark, the sort of afternoon that bred improper thoughts in Sunday school teachers and dampness in gentlemen's cuffs. The air hung low and cold above the Wiltshire village of Great Tassington, weighted with a mist that oozed like old treacle through the lich gate of St. Ethelgaitha's church, and curled possessively around the more successful tombstones. Wimsey, slightly stooped under a grey felt trilby and twiddling an ivory-handled cane he had no use for, was staring fixedly at a particular headstone. Alice Maud Fenchurch, he read aloud. Born 1893, died, good Lord, 1937. She smiled at life and smiled still in death. He turned to the vicar, the Reverend Clive Blunden, a narrow man with the cautious optimism of one who had recently convinced the choir to attempt Tallis. "Say, vicar," Wimsey said with the particular lightness of tone he reserved for pronouncements of minor heresy, "does it strike you as odd that a woman who died in 1937 has, according to this monument, been laid to rest in 1939? Blunden blinked, then leaned in. "Good heavens," he murmured. "That must be a mason's error." Wimsey crouched, inspecting the headstone with the air of a solicitor contemplating a dubious codicil. Unless, of course, the woman was a prophetess and arranged her own interment with enviable foresight. Still, she must have been a devil to schedule dinner with. A cough interrupted their ecclesiastical banter. It belonged to Police Constable Jim Wicklow, whose boots squelched ominously as he approached from the path. "Beg pardon, my lord." "Reverend, they've found a body in the Fenchurch crypt." Blunden turned a peculiar colour, somewhere between wet parchment and undercooked mutton. "In the crypt?" "Yes, sir. Parish handyman says there was a smell, well, stronger than usual. Went down to check, and there she is. A woman laid out in the Fenchurch vault like she'd taken up family residence. Neat as anything. Bit too neat, if you ask me." Wimsey, who had not been asked, straightened and removed his gloves with the fastidiousness of a man preparing to read bad poetry. "A woman, you say? Dare one ask if she was smiling?" Wicklow shifted. "Bit hard to say, sir, not in a state you'd call cheerful. Pity. It would have made a capital symmetry." Wimsey's voice warmed with that peculiar inflection it took when he was about to chase death through the back gardens of the English gentry. "Shall we?" The descent into the crypt was via a tight spiral of stone steps, as damp and pitted as a miser's conscience. The vault was modest by noble standards. No grotesque effigies or crumbling banners, just a row of lead-lidded coffins and a notable chill that seemed to emanate more from history than from temperature. At the end of the aisle lay a bier, and, upon it, with arms folded decorously, was the cause of their afternoon's diversion. She was perhaps in her early 40s, dressed in what had once been a navy blue travelling coat with smart lapels. Her hair was still set, her hands gloved. The odour was ripe but not ruinous, and her face, slack now in its posthumous collapse, nonetheless bore disturbingly the shadow of a smile. Blunden murmured a prayer under his breath. "Remarkably well preserved," Wimsey said lightly. "Almost. As though she'd only just finished waiting for a train. Wicklow, has she been identified?" "No, sir, never seen her before. There's nothing on her, no handbag, no papers, just the coat, gloves and shoes. Heels, decent quality. London. Make, I'd guess." Wimsey moved closer, then crouched with almost feline grace. He peered at the shoes. "Fortnum and Howell's," he said. "You can tell by the stitching, not cheap. A woman who dressed to travel and never arrived. But why here? And why her?" He tapped the edge of the bier. "This is new wood," he added. "Not 6 weeks old, someone made space for her. Carefully, deliberately, no accident, no flight, just placement." "Do you think she was murdered?" asked the vicar, hushed. Wimsey turned his pale eyes to him, vaguely amused. "My dear Reverend, when one finds a strange woman interred with a family to which she demonstrably does not belong, in a tomb which has not been opened in years, then, unless the woman walked in of her own accord and lay down to a dignified decomposition, I believe we may consider foul play. At least provisionally." Outside, the wind began to rise. Somewhere among the tombs a crow gave a strangled, phlegmatic cry. Lord Peter glanced once more at the smiling corpse, and then at the erroneous date etched in stone above. "Well," he said lightly, If this is the grave she smiled at, one really must inquire what she knew that the rest of us didn't. He straightened. Let's have the servants interviewed. And do get someone to check the church records, Wicklow. I want a list of everyone with access to this crypt and everyone who had business here in the past fortnight. Something tells me this woman did not arrive by ghost train. And thus began the peculiar case of the woman who smiled at her own grave. Wimsey did not care for crypts, particularly when they had been reappropriated without so much as a by your leave. And while he appreciated the company of corpses in their proper context, preferably quiet, well-placed, and with all their papers in order, this one had upset the essential decorum of the thing. Death, in his view, ought to know its place, and this woman quite evidently did not. Back above ground, the mist had thickened. It swelled in the hedgerows and curled against the mullioned windows of the vicarage like something waiting to be invited in. Wimsey, however, had invited himself into the vicar's drawing-room, where a hasty fire had been coaxed into life, and a maid with anxious wrists produced tepid tea and an assortment of nervous biscuits. Wimsey declined the tea with a pleasant shudder. "Never trust a brew that apologizes before one tastes it," he said, and turned instead to the business of the day. He had sent Constable Wicklow to summon anyone with the faintest claim to relevance. Verger, cleaner, gardener, even the milkman, if he happened to drop his rounds near the churchyard wall. And so they came, each one as blandly bewildered as the last. First was Mrs. Mott, the verger's wife, who smelled of beeswax and suspicion. She adjusted her shawl with slow precision and insisted on calling Wimsey "Your Worship," despite repeated and increasingly weary corrections. "Oh, I never go down into the crypt," she said, in the tone of one who wouldn't dream of soiling her good sense with such a notion. "My husband does the polishing when he bothers, which is not often. I do the rest, candles and such. Though I did mention to Reverend Blunden that the key had gone missing, now I think of it." "Missing?" Wimsey leaned forward, his expression sharpening as if he'd caught a faint scent of significance. "Do tell." "Well, I keep it on a hook in the sacristy, marked and everything. About a fortnight ago I saw it was gone. Thought my husband had it, but he said not. And then it was back again 2 days later, right in its place. Did you report this to the police?" Mrs. Mott pursed her lips. "I mentioned it to Miss Derleth at the flower rota. She said it was probably borrowed for cleaning." "And is Miss Derleth in the habit of cleaning the crypt?" "Heavens, no. She won't even water the lilies unless she's had a sherry." Wimsey thanked her with elaborate courtesy and dismissed her before she could elaborate on the moral shortcomings of the flower rota. Next came Mr. Mott himself, a wizened man with a hearing aid that squealed defiantly whenever truth approached. "Nothing strange down there?" Wimsey repeated, louder, "Mr." Mott scratched his head. "Well, maybe. There was a smell, you know, not new. Been coming and going since early May. Thought it was rats, set traps, nothing caught. No sign of disturbance?" Mr. Mott shook his head. "All the coffins was shut up tight. Didn't see no one poking about. Then again, who'd want to, hey?" "Indeed, and yet someone did." Wimsey paused. "Tell me, how would one access the crypt without being seen?" "Oh, easy. You can slip in through the vestry door after dark. Not locked proper, you see. Old hinges, bit of a push, and you're through. We're meant to get it fixed, but no one's got round to it. Costs, you know." Wimsey nodded. The picture was acquiring contour. An unlocked door, a missing key, a smell that came and went like a guilty conscience. He was about to call for the next interviewee when the door creaked, and in stepped a woman of about 50 with the imperious gait of someone who had never taken no for an answer and didn't intend to start now. "Miss Derleth," she announced, seating herself before being invited. "I expect you've been told I know nothing. That's quite correct. I make it a principle." Wimsey smiled. "Splendid. May I ask what else you make a principle of?" "Order. Tradition. And not speaking ill of the dead, though in this case I'm not entirely certain which dead we're speaking of." Wimsey offered a nod of agreement. "A fair point. Would you say anything about the church arrangements had changed of late? New faces, unusual visitors?" Derleth sniffed. "Some stranger was about in the churchyard last week. Tuesday evening. I saw a torchlight but assumed it was your man, Mott, doing some nocturnal fussing." Wimsey blinked. "At what time?" "Oh, Must have been after 10. I'd been to the rectory for a meeting, flower budgets, mind you, nothing scandalous, and was walking home past the south wall. The light bobbed along the path and then disappeared down into the crypt stair. And you didn't stop to investigate? My lord, I live alone with a rheumatic cat. I do not pursue shadows into graveyards. Prudent, he murmured. Very prudent. After a few more civilians, each less illuminating than the last, Whimsy took a turn about the churchyard, hands deep in his coat pockets, cane tapping lightly at frost-bitten grass. He paused at the Fenchurch tomb once more. The headstone still bore its misleading date like a sardonic invitation. He crouched and ran his gloved hand along the lip of the stone slab. New mortar, he muttered. They sealed it again, and not too long ago. Wicklow, the constable, appeared from behind a yew tree, looking vaguely apologetic, as though he'd been caught eavesdropping on a funeral. Get me a list of all recent burials last 6 weeks, and check who ordered stonework repairs. Something's not square. Wicklow scribbled diligently, nodding, and Wicklow, quietly. No lantern swinging or uniform clomping. I want to know who touched this tomb without the town knowing it. The constable saluted with slightly more gusto than the moment required, and trotted off. Whimsy remained crouched a moment longer, eyes narrowing. There was, he reflected, an elegance to the whole affair that irritated him. The woman, well-dressed, with no apparent struggle or violence, had been placed with great care as if she had every right to be there. Her expression had not been one of terror, but serenity, at odds with her clandestine burial. Someone had gone to great lengths not to make her disappear, but to make her belong. He rose and dusted his knees. There was an implication in that. Not just of guilt, but of sentiment, affection even. This was not a disposal, it was a tribute, an attempt to restore, to include, to rewrite something lost. He glanced up at the vicarage window, where Blunden hovered like a moth behind a pane. Someone, Whimsy murmured, wanted her remembered. He turned toward the path, the cane clicking at his side, which meant someone somewhere remembered her still. He smiled, slowly, thoughtfully, not unlike the woman in the crypt, not unlike a man who had just scented the first turn of the key. The next morning broke under a slate-grey sky, the kind that promised rain but, as so often in England, failed to deliver decisively one way or the other. Whimsy, having exchanged his trilby for the more functional deerstalker, a concession to necessity rather than fashion, found himself strolling toward the village post office, where the local papers and parish registers were habitually deposited and occasionally perused. He was not a man to neglect the mundane avenues of investigation. The list Wicklow had provided lay in his hand, 7 burials within the last 2 months, a modest tally for a parish of Great Tassingdon's modest size. All bore the expected trappings, joy of age and infirmity, save for one, a certain Miss Marian Locke, interred scarcely 3 weeks prior. The name was unfamiliar to Whimsy, which was no small curiosity in itself. Great Tassingdon was a place where everyone's antecedents were known, or at least muttered over a pint. A quick inquiry at the village inn confirmed that Miss Locke was something of an enigma. The landlord's wife, an obliging if somewhat conspiratorial woman named Mrs. Goodwin, recalled Marian as a quiet sort, who had moved into the old willow cottage on the edge of the village only last autumn. "Never much company, mind you," she said, polishing a glass with the air of delivering a state secret. Kept herself to herself, mostly seen at church on Sundays and, I dare say, a bit of reading by the fire. Whimsy nodded. A recluse recently settled, now deceased and buried under curious circumstances in a crypt belonging to an entirely different family. The incongruity sharpened his interest. The churchwarden's accounts, which he examined with the fastidiousness of a man deciphering a ledger rather than a litany, revealed the payment for repairs to the Fenchurch tomb. The work had been commissioned just days before Marian Locke's burial. The mason was a Mr. Hobson, a stonemason of some local repute, who recalled the job with a certain reluctant pride. "A delicate matter," Hobson explained, twirling his pipe as if it might resolve the puzzle. "They wanted the ceiling done neat and proper. Told me it was a matter of family honor. Paid handsomely, too. Strange times, I said. Who commissioned it?" Lady Fenchurch herself, or so she said, came down from London. Hands as cold as the crypt itself, if you ask me. Wimsey's eyes twinkled. Lady Fenchurch? That adds a layer of complexity. Indeed it did. The Fenchurch family, while historically venerable, had dwindled to a single surviving member, the formidable widow of Sir Reginald Fenchurch, known locally for her iron will and a reputation for strict propriety. A woman who Wimsey suspected might have strong opinions about family tombs and the sanctity of names. A visit to the Fenchurch estate, a sombre Georgian pile cloaked in ivy and disdain, brought Wimsey face to face with Lady Agatha Fenchurch herself. The widow was a tall woman of rigid posture and colder eyes, dressed in black with an air of mourning that seemed to have settled permanently over her. She received Wimsey in the drawing-room, where heavy velvet curtains muted the morning light. "I am aware of the unfortunate discovery in the crypt," she said without preamble, "and while I understand the police must investigate, I must insist that the sanctity of the family resting place be maintained." Wimsey inclined his head. "Of course, Lady Fenchurch. Your family's wishes will be respected. May I ask then what you know of Miss Marian Locke?" A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, perhaps something deeper, passed across her face. Miss Locke was a friend of my late husband's. They met in London many years ago. After Reginald's death, she chose to retire to this village. I respected her privacy, though she was welcome here. Yet she was not buried with the Fenchurchs until very recently. Lady Fenchurch's lips pressed thin. She asked for a place among us. I agreed. It was Reginald's wish too. She was family in all but blood. Wimsey pondered the implications. A friendship strong enough to warrant posthumous inclusion in a family crypt suggested ties beyond mere acquaintance. But why the secrecy? Why the delayed burial? May I inquire why the interment took place weeks after her death? There were complications, Lady Fenchurch admitted reluctantly. Certain paperwork, permissions, not the sort of thing one rushes, particularly with delicate matters of law and family reputation. Wimsey's gaze did not waver. And the key to the crypt? It appears it went missing shortly before Miss Locke's burial, only to return shortly after. The widow's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. Family secrets are best kept with discretion, Lord Peter. I am not at liberty to discuss every detail with a stranger. A pity. But then, the best mysteries often begin with what is left unsaid. Lady Fenchurch regarded him silently for a moment, then stood. "I will consider what I may share in due course," she said, voice firm. "But I trust you understand that certain matters require delicacy." Perfectly understood. Wimsey rose as well, nodding with a measured smile. "Thank you for your time, Lady Fenchurch." Outside, the chill of the estate's grounds was more biting than the morning air. Wimsey's thoughts churned. A missing key, a delayed burial, a friend-turned-family whose final resting place had stirred more questions than answers, and a widow who guarded her secrets as jealously as a cat its territory. As he walked back toward the village, Wimsey's mind turned over the small inconsistencies that had gathered like shadows around the case. The scent of a puzzle, faint but unmistakable, lingered in the damp air. Returning to the church, he found Constable Wicklow awaiting him, looking somewhat pale beneath his standard-issue helmet. "Sir," Wicklow began, "there's been a development. The clock in the church tower, it stopped. Strange thing is, it halted precisely at 10:15 p.m., the night Miss Locke supposedly entered the crypt." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. Coincidence? Hardly. The clock's mechanism is usually reliable, maintained monthly. This halt was abrupt, and the hands were misaligned when the clock was next inspected. Someone tampered with it. The pieces clicked. A disabled clock, a door left unlocked, a missing key, a burial out of time. Whoever had placed Marian Locke in the crypt had engineered more than a simple interment. They had manipulated time itself, or at least the perception of it. "Wicklow, we must find who had access to the clock tower that evening." The constable nodded and hurried off. Wimsey stood alone in the fading light, eyes cast upward toward the ancient clock face, its hands frozen in defiance. Somewhere in Great Tassingdon, a secret was ticking down to its revelation. The game, as always, was afoot. The church clock, suspended high above the village like a silent sentinel, held its secret stubbornly. Wimsey, in his usual methodical fashion, determined that if the mechanism had been stopped and tampered with, then the culprit must have had both the motive and the opportunity, not to mention a certain technical facility. The question was who? He began by interrogating the church's small retinue of custodians and odd job men. The sexton, Mr. Gribble, a gaunt man whose hands looked as if they had never quite learnt to open fully, was the first to be summoned. When questioned about access to the clock tower, Gribble was emphatic. "Only I and the verger have the key," he said, with the twitch of a mouth that suggested an unspoken addendum. "The verger's out of commission this week. Swallowed a nasty cold. I do the rounds." "Does that include winding the clock?" "Not usually. Mr. Langley, the clocksmith, comes once a month to wind it and oil the works. I keep an eye out for any trouble." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "When was the last time Mr. Langley was here?" 3 weeks ago, before the weather turned. That placed the clock's mechanical servicing well before the night in question. The sudden halt at 10:15 p.m., therefore, had to be the work of a deliberate human agent. Whimsy pressed further, asking if anyone else might have had access, or if there had been recent visitors to the church. Gribble shifted uneasily. "Well, there's been talk of that young fellow from the village, Oliver Bentham. He's always hanging about, fixing things, fiddling with gadgets. Not a proper job, more a tinkerer. People say he's fond of the occult, though I wouldn't trust those tales myself." Occult, thought Whimsy. The phrase had an unpleasant echo, the kind of whisper that sets old village tongues wagging. It might explain the subtle unease surrounding the whole affair, but Whimsy was quick to remind himself that superstition was the refuge of the unimaginative. He resolved to pay a visit to this Oliver Bentham. The lad was not hard to find. The Bentham family home was a ramshackle workshop on the outskirts of the village, cluttered with machinery and strange contraptions half assembled. Oliver himself was a wiry youth with a quick smile and hands that never quite stopped moving. "I hear you've taken a fancy to the church clock," Whimsy began, observing the gears and springs sprawled across a workbench. Oliver laughed, sound somewhere between a chuckle and a cough. "I do a bit of repairs here and there. The church clock's ancient, Sir Peter, and more than a bit temperamental, but I wasn't anywhere near it on the night Miss Locke died." "Your alibi?" "I was at the village pub, the Black Crow. It's got a dozen witnesses at least." Whimsy arched an eyebrow. "A popular establishment, then?" The boy shrugged. "More like a noisy one. You can ask the landlord, old Tom. I was there from 8 until closing time." A visit to the Black Crow confirmed this. The landlord was a burly man with a booming voice and a ruddy complexion, who confirmed Oliver's presence and good humor throughout the evening. The young man had been drinking, but not enough to lose his faculties nor to leave the premises. With Oliver tentatively ruled out, Whimsy's attention returned to the key, the one missing from the sacristy, then mysteriously returned. He revisited. Mrs. Mott, who was prickly about the whole affair but reluctantly admitted that the key's disappearance had coincided with a flurry of activity in the church earlier that week. "Some folk came from London, I heard," she said, "carrying boxes and parchments, saying something about wills and property. I didn't see them properly, but they stayed long enough to rattle the vestry windows." Whimsy's thoughts circled back to Lady Fenchurch and the hinted complications. Over paperwork. A will, perhaps, or something more delicate. Legal adjustments, changes in inheritance. The afternoon deepened into early evening, as Whimsy returned to the vicarage to find Reverend Blunden awaiting him in the study, a stack of parish records on his desk. "I hope you don't mind," the vicar said, eyes bright despite the day's gloom. "I've been going through old parish registers and have found a curious detail. Do tell." "There is no record of Marian Locke's baptism or marriage anywhere in the county," Blunden said. "And yet local tradition insists she was connected to the village long before she moved here. A ghost of a past, then," Whimsy murmured. "Or a carefully concealed one." The vicar nodded. "Which raises the question, who was she?" "Really? And why was she buried in the Fenchurch crypt rather than a simple parish grave?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "The plot thickens, Reverend. The simplest explanation is often wrong." They pored over the registers together, cross-referencing names and dates, until a pattern emerged. Marian Locke was a name that appeared in no official record, yet there were repeated mentions of a Miss Locke in letters and diaries, belonging to the late Sir Reginald Fenchurch, housed in the family archives. "Shall we pay Lady Fenchurch another visit?" Whimsy suggested. Blunden agreed, and that evening they returned to the Georgian manor. Lady Fenchurch was less guarded this time, perhaps softened by the dusk or the quiet persistence of the inquiry. "Miss Locke was my husband's confidant," she revealed, though not without controversy. Their relationship was never fully understood. Some said she was his secretary, others a muse. After his death, she chose the village as a refuge from London's gossip. Whimsy's mind pieced together the shadowy outlines. A woman who lived, on the edge of social visibility, whose death had stirred whispers that reached far beyond the village boundaries. Was there any discord between Miss Locke and the family? He inquired. Lady Fenchurch hesitated. Not openly, but there were tensions. Some of the estate's heirs were displeased with the arrangements my late husband made. Marian's inclusion in the family crypt was a particular point of contention. Whimsy felt the weight of unspoken conflicts, the petty jealousies, the wounded pride, the silent battles waged behind closed doors. As they departed, the chill night air carried the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Whimsy's thoughts lingered on the stopped clock, the missing key, the sealed tomb, and the woman who smiled at her own grave. All these threads, tangled and dark, awaited his patient unraveling. The next step, he knew, was to scrutinize the timeline, precisely when Marian Locke died, who saw her last, and how the careful choreography of concealment had been executed. A faint smile played upon his lips. The game was well and truly afoot. Lord Peter Whimsy returned to the vicarage at a thoughtful pace, the evening air carrying the faint scent of rain and smouldering wood from countless hearths throughout Great Tassingdon. The village was settling into its customary quiet, the occasional bark of a distant dog punctuating the soft murmur of wind through bare branches. Yet beneath this peaceful veneer, the threads of the mystery tugged insistently at his mind. The next logical step was, as he had decided, to reconstruct the timeline with meticulous care. The matter of Marian Locke's death and subsequent burial was curiously elusive, a fact exacerbated by the absence of immediate witnesses and the deliberate obfuscation surrounding her final hours. The villagers' reticence was almost comical, in its unanimity, as if a tacit conspiracy of silence had been agreed upon. Whimsy summoned Constable Wicklow to the vicarage, where together they laid out all known facts, testimonies, and official reports. The constable's notes were neat, though occasionally uncertain where to classify some observations that seemed to skirt the edges of relevance. "Let us begin with the time of death," Whimsy suggested, eyeing the spread of documents and notes. "Dr. Harcourt's examination is precise. Death from cardiac arrest, probably caused by an undiagnosed condition exacerbated by stress or physical strain. No signs of foul play externally, no evidence of poisoning." Wicklow nodded. "Yet, the exact hour remains approximate, sometime between 9 and 10:30 on the evening of the 10th. That window is, I admit, frustratingly broad," Whimsy admitted, "but the precision of that clock's stoppage at 10:15 p.m. may provide a clue, either the time of death or the time of concealment." They examined witness statements, starting with those who claimed to have seen Marian Locke that evening. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Blunden, recounted seeing Marian in the church porch at around 8:45 p.m., apparently speaking with a man whose face she could not discern in the dim light. The village postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Pringle, remembered Marian stopping briefly at the post office earlier that afternoon, but did not see her after. More puzzling were the servants' statements from Willow Cottage. The housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling, insisted that Marian was in bed by 9, unwell and resting. Yet the gardener, a taciturn man called Harris, claimed he saw her in the garden just before dusk, arranging plants, a normal enough activity but suggestive of a restless mind. Whimsy observed the contradictions with his customary detached amusement. Nothing quite like the collective conviction of servants who swear they know nothing, but whose every gesture suggests they know everything. Wicklow frowned. "It's like they're protecting someone, or something," Whimsy mused. "One must ask, who benefits from a cloak of silence?" He spent the better part of the morning revisiting the scenes: Willow Cottage, the churchyard, the crypt. The crypt itself, he noted, was unusually chilly for early spring, damp stone and shadow conspiring to preserve secrets. He inspected the lock on the crypt door, now replaced but evidently simple, a warded lock, no mechanism to speak of. Access, therefore, relied almost entirely on possession of the key and discretion. Returning to the village, Wimsey sought out Miss Pringle again, this time to probe more deeply into the mysterious man seen with Marian in the church porch. The postmistress's eyes flickered with a hint of reluctance. "I couldn't see much of him, just his coat and the shape of his hat," she said. But it wasn't the Reverend, that's certain. He wore something darker, more formal. Wimsey's mind raced. A stranger, or perhaps an unexpected visitor. The possibility of a clandestine meeting at twilight added layers to the enigma. Could this man have been the key to Marian's fate? Later in the village inn, he overheard hushed talk of a Mr. Edward Grantham, a solicitor from London, who had been seen arriving at Willow Cottage a few days before Marian's death. The name resonated faintly with the hints of legal wrangling Lady Fenchurch had alluded to. Wimsey arranged a meeting with this Mr. Grantham, who proved a sleek, unruffled man, precise in his words and cautious in demeanour. The solicitor confirmed that he had come to Great Tassingdon to discuss the late Miss Locke's will and certain property matters connected to the Fenchurch estate. Miss Locke held a life interest in a small parcel of land adjoining the estate, Grantham explained. Her tenure was conditional on certain obligations, none of which she fully satisfied. The question of her burial in the family crypt was complicated by these legal entanglements. Wimsey pressed for more. Was there a dispute with Lady Fenchurch over these obligations? Grantham's eyes flickered. Let's say Lady Fenchurch was less than enthusiastic about Marian's claims. There were letters, heated exchanges, though I cannot disclose their full contents. Did Miss Locke express concerns about her safety or well-being? Not explicitly, but the tone of some correspondence suggested anxiety. She felt isolated, isolation. The word hung heavy. It suggested vulnerability, perhaps motive. Wimsey considered the possibility that Marian's death, though natural in cause, had been hastened or obscured for reasons beyond mere chance. Piecing the testimonies, timelines, and legal intricacies together, Wimsey realized that the night of the 10th had been carefully choreographed. The clock stopped at precisely 10:15 p.m., not a coincidence, but a deliberate signal or cover. The key to the crypt's temporary disappearance was no accident either, but part of a plan to manage access covertly. He returned to the church at twilight, observing the slow settling of shadows and the faint chimes of distant bells. It was a place where time, both measured and human, seemed to twist and bend, a fitting stage for a drama of secrets and silence. As he stepped into the nave, Wimsey felt the eyes of history watching. Each stone whispered tales of duty, betrayal, and unspoken grief. The village itself, with its quaint facades and polite faces, was a mask worn over something darker. The pieces were close to fitting, though one remained elusive. The true nature of Marian Locke's relationship with Lady Fenchurch and the family. Was it loyalty, guilt, a bond forged in secrets too dangerous to reveal? Wimsey's lips twitched with that faint smile reserved for moments of impending clarity. Soon the truth would emerge, not from ghosts or shadows, but from the precise workings of human nature, exposed under the sharp light of logic. He had but to follow the trail of detail. A misplaced word, a misaligned clock hand, the half-glance of a servant, and the mask would fall away. The night was deepening, and with it, the mystery's pulse quickened. Wimsey's reflections on the tangled web surrounding Marian Locke were abruptly interrupted by a small, seemingly inconsequential detail that he had overlooked until now. The letter found in the sacristy drawer, beneath the altar cloth, the one Miss Pringle had discovered but deemed unimportant. It was a brief, unsigned note, written on fine stationery, hinting at a meeting, an urgent rendezvous, in fact, that had been arranged for the very evening of the 10th. The letter read, "Do not forget our arrangement. The consequences will be dire if you fail to appear. Midnight by the old yew tree." Wimsey turned the paper over with the careful reverence one reserves for ancient parchment, but this was a modern script, crisp and clipped. The arrangement was vague, the tone unyielding. What could be the nature of such a meeting? And who had summoned Marian to the old yew tree, long a fixture at the edge of the churchyard, its twisted limbs dark against the moonlit sky? He knew, as any good detective does, that letters like this were both keys and traps, an invitation to secrets best left alone, yet an indispensable breadcrumb in the trail of truth. Determined to follow this lead, Whimsy sought out the churchyard, once again this time under the wan light of the early evening. The old yew tree stood sentinel, its knotted branches clawing skyward like the fingers of some ancient guardian. Beneath it, the grass was worn, as if many feet had passed this way, despite the chill of spring. A careful inspection revealed a faint disturbance in the soil near the roots, a scattering of dried leaves, a recent scuff mark in the dirt. Whimsy's keen eye caught what others might have missed, a tiny fragment of paper, half buried, with the partial imprint of an address stamped faintly in ink. He pocketed the scrap, already piecing together the narrative. Someone had met Marian here. The meeting had been clandestine, marked by tension. Next, Whimsy questioned the local postmistress again, pressing her for any memory of strange arrivals or departures around that time. Miss Pringle, visibly uneasy, admitted that a man matching the description of the dark-coated stranger had been seen loitering near the churchyard on the night in question, but fled hastily when approached. "Most unusual for our village," she said. "People don't usually run," Whimsy nodded. "It seems your visitor was more than a casual wanderer." Turning his attention to the servants at Willow Cottage, Whimsy requested to see the letters and documents Marian had kept, any trace of her correspondence or connections. Mrs. Tilling, though guarded at first, reluctantly produced a small bundle of papers, tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon. Among these was a curious diary, its pages filled with careful handwriting, recording meetings, thoughts, and doubts. One entry stood, "Out March 8th. The arrangement grows perilous. I cannot trust Lady Fenchurch to safeguard my interests. Edward Grantham's reassurances are cold comfort. Must keep the meeting tonight secret or all is lost." Whimsy's lips twitched with satisfaction. This was the double life he had suspected, the psychological strain of a woman caught between loyalty, fear, and ambition. He shared the diary's contents with Reverend Blunden, whose pale face betrayed his discomfort. "Miss Locke's struggles were more severe than I had imagined," he murmured. "No wonder the village whispers with unease." In the ensuing days, Whimsy sought out Edward Grantham once more, carefully framing his questions to provoke subtle admissions without revealing his full hand. Grantham, polished and composed, confirmed that the meeting under the yew tree was intended to finalize certain legal adjustments, specifically the transfer of Marian's rights and interests to the Fenchurch estate, a matter complicated by the presence of a previously unknown codicil to the will. Miss Locke was reluctant, Grantham admitted. She feared the implications for her own security, and perhaps for the reputation of those involved. Did she ever express any threats or fears concerning Lady Fenchurch? The solicitor's eyes narrowed slightly. Not directly, but she was aware that the lady was determined to protect the estate's integrity at any cost. It was the kind of veiled warning that made Whimsy's thoughts circle back to the servant's silence, the missing key, and the clock's sudden cessation. Something about the night's choreography remained hidden. The final act had yet to be revealed. A breakthrough came when Whimsy requested access to the family archives at Fenchurch Manor. Among the letters and papers, he found correspondence between Marian Locke and Lady Fenchurch that was candid and fraught with tension. One letter, dated only weeks before Marian's death, was particularly telling. "Dearest Marian, I entreat you to reconsider your obstinacy. The estate's peace depends on your cooperation. For both our sakes, let us not be driven to needless strife. Yours, C.F." The tone was icy, laced with a polite but unmistakable warning. Whimsy's mind returned to the crypt. If Marian had indeed been forced into an agreement, one she might have resisted to the end, then her final resting place was not simply a gesture of kindness, but a calculated symbol of dominion. He realized that the missing key and the stopped clock were acts of concealment, designed to delay discovery and manipulate perceptions of time and access. Whoever had arranged the burial was as concerned with appearances as with legalities. Yet, who had the most to gain? Whimsy sat late into the night, reconstructing the timeline. Marian's final meeting, the secret correspondence, the involvement of Lady Fenchurch and Grantham, the servants' evasions, and the curious behavior of the church clock. In all these, he discerned a pattern of control and subtle intimidation, masked by genteel politeness. The story was one of psychological manipulation, a battle waged with letters and locks, threats and silences, rather than overt violence. Marian Locke's death, though natural in cause, had been shadowed by this conflict. Her smile at her own grave was a final, defiant gesture against those who sought to bind her fate. Whimsy felt the pieces fall into place like the turning of a great mechanism. Now all that remained was to reveal the truth beneath the layers, to bring the hidden actors into the light. He prepared to call together those involved, to reconstruct the final night, to challenge the assumptions, and to unsettle the polished facades of Great Tassington. For the game was nearly over, and the final act was about to begin. Lord Peter Whimsy stood quietly in the parlour of the vicarage, the afternoon sun slanting through lace curtains to fall in geometric patterns across the polished wood. The gathered company, each summoned under the pretence of offering further statements, now regarded him with various mixtures of apprehension and polite curiosity. The servants, the postmistress, Reverend Blunden, Lady Fenchurch, and Mr. Grantham, all were present, though the atmosphere bore the brittle tension of a finely drawn wire ready to snap. Whimsy's demeanour was, as ever, composed with an almost academic detachment, his sharp eyes betraying an amused satisfaction that only grew as he prepared to unravel the mystery that had both vexed and intrigued him. The time had come to test the final threads of testimony against the intricate web of facts he had so painstakingly assembled. He began with a calm but incisive review of the timeline of the evening in question, deliberately emphasizing inconsistencies and inviting corrections without revealing the full extent of his knowledge. "Let us recall, then, the hour of Marian Locke's final movements," he began, adjusting his spectacles with the manner of a scholar about to deliver a lecture. "Miss Pringle, you observed Miss Locke in the church porch around 8:45 p.m., conversing with a man unknown to you. Pray, did you notice any distinguishing features, even in the dim light?" The postmistress swallowed visibly. "Only the colour. Say of his coat, dark, almost black, and his hat rather formal." I could not see his face clearly. "Thank you," Whimsy said, turning smoothly to Reverend Blunden. "And you, Reverend, can confirm your whereabouts during this period?" The vicar cleared his throat. "Indeed, I was conducting my evening prayers in the vestry until shortly after 9. I heard no disturbance." Whimsy's eyes lingered a moment longer. "Yet Mrs. Tilling, the housekeeper, insists Miss Locke was in bed by 9, unwell." Mrs. Tilling nodded, but her lips pressed tightly together. "That is correct, my lord. Marian was indisposed and retired early." "Ah, but Mr. Harris, the gardener, claims to have seen her in the garden arranging plants just before dusk." A faint murmur passed among the assembled. Whimsy raised a finger. "Notice how these statements resist neat alignment, a trifling discordance that often conceals a deeper truth. One cannot be both in bed and arranging plants outside within minutes of each other, can one?" The gardener shifted uneasily. "I only saw her once that evening, perhaps just after 6. "Precisely," Whimsy said, nodding. "So it is not impossible that she retired early but was also seen later, if the timing is correct." Lady Fenchurch, seated with an elegant detachment, interjected smoothly. "Is this a matter of temporal precision or of human memory, Lord Whimsy? One would expect some minor errors in recollection, given the stress of recent events." "Minor errors indeed, Lady Fenchurch," Whimsy agreed. "But when the error stretches to a full hour or more, and when those hours are critical, one must look closer." He turned then to the matter of the crypt, his gaze fixing on Grantham. "Mr. Grantham, you mentioned a legal complication regarding Marian Locke's burial rites. Could you elaborate?" The solicitor's expression tightened. "The family crypt is traditionally reserved for direct descendants, or those with clear legal claim. Marian's tenure on the estate was tenuous, conditional on her compliance with certain agreements. Her burial here was irregular, requiring special dispensation. Yet her remains were placed there nonetheless, Wimsey remarked. Was this dispensation granted freely, or was it a reluctant concession? Grantham hesitated. A reluctant one, I admit. The family wished to avoid scandal. Scandal, Wimsey echoed softly. And yet the key to the crypt was missing on the night of the burial. A flicker of surprise crossed Grantham's face, though it quickly vanished. Wimsey pressed on. Such a detail suggests more than mere oversight. It implies deliberate concealment or control. Lady Fenchurch's composed exterior cracked ever so slightly. You insinuate, Lord Wimsey, that there was a design behind these events? I simply suggest, Wimsey replied smoothly, that certain measures were taken to control access and influence perceptions. For example, the church clock's cessation at 10:15 p.m. Curious, is it not, that it stopped at the exact moment one might suppose the burial was taking place? Mrs. Tilling gasped softly, while the vicar cleared his throat awkwardly. An odd coincidence, Lady Fenchurch said, voice cool but edged with tension. Indeed, Wimsey said. Or an artifice. He paused, letting the implication settle. If I may, it appears that on the night in question the passing of time was carefully manipulated, that the presence and absence of certain individuals were arranged with intent. Turning to Miss Pringle, he asked gently, You mentioned a man who fled upon being noticed. Might that have been Mr. Grantham or someone acting on his behalf? Miss Pringle shook her head. No, he was different. Taller, perhaps younger. Curious, Wimsey murmured. A third party, then, with his own role in this drama. He then brought forward the letter found in the sacristy, reading aloud the terse summons to a midnight meeting beneath the yew tree. Who, I wonder, arranged this clandestine meeting, Wimsey mused, and for what purpose? Eyes darted among the company. Lady Fenchurch's gaze hardened. It is known that Miss Locke had many concerns but no proof of threats. Ah, but fear need not be proven to influence actions, Wimsey said with a faint smile, and neither do such. Letters always bear the signature of their sender. He allowed a pregnant pause. Miss Locke kept a diary that reveals anxiety and mistrust, especially toward Lady Fenchurch and Mr. Grantham. Yet despite this, she did attend a secret meeting that night. Reverend Blunden's expression darkened. Would that meeting not have been a chance for reconciliation or confrontation? Wimsey replied. He recounted the soil disturbance near the yew tree and the partial paper fragment bearing an address, likely dropped or left behind in haste. These fragments, though small, speak volumes. They tell of a meeting fraught with tension and of secrets hidden beneath the surface of polite village life. Wimsey's voice lowered, his tone sharpening with subtle irony. I suggest that Marian Locke's final hours were governed by psychological warfare, an attempt to wrest control of her fate and ultimately her legacy. A faint murmur of assent and protest rippled through the room. Her death, Wimsey concluded, though medically natural, was shadowed by this struggle. And her burial, so carefully managed, so symbolically placed, was not merely a gesture of respect but a statement of power. He fixed Lady Fenchurch with a steady gaze. I believe you understand this, madam. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded slightly. Wimsey rose, signaling the gathering's end. We have arrived at the cusp of revelation. The stage is set, the players assembled. Soon the mask of civility will fall, and the truth, as always, will be stranger than any fiction. As the visitors departed, each cast furtive glances at one another, the polite facades fractured by suspicion and fear. Wimsey remained alone, the weight of the evening's revelations pressing upon him. The final puzzle pieces awaited their place, the intricate mechanism of motive, opportunity, and deception ready to be revealed. In the dimming light, the vicarage seemed less a sanctuary and more a theatre, where shadows played and secrets danced. And at its centre stood Lord Peter Wimsey, poised to unveil the dark heart beating beneath Great Tassington's genteel surface. The night had settled over Great Tassington like a slow, creeping shadow. The village hushed except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant barking of a restless dog. Lord Peter Wimsey found himself once again drawn to the churchyard. the place where secrets seemed to linger, among the twisted branches of the ancient yew and the cold stone of the crypt. The moon cast a pale, spectral light, lending a faint chill to the air that was not altogether due to the season. He stood beneath the boughs, alone save for the faint stirring of night creatures, and allowed his mind to retrace the steps that had brought him here. The intricate pattern of Marian Locke's final days, the clandestine meetings, the carefully manipulated timelines, the missing key and the stopped clock. All these threads converged like the intersecting shadows at his feet. But one puzzle remained stubbornly incomplete: the identity of the man who fled from the churchyard, the stranger who had slipped through the village's polite defenses like a ghost. Whimsy had spent the afternoon quietly interviewing those who might have glimpsed more. The postmistress had been uneasy, the gardener reluctant, and the housekeeper tense, but none could identify the mysterious figure beyond the fragmentary descriptions already known. Yet, the fragment of paper he had retrieved from the soil beneath, the yew suggested that this stranger was more than a mere casual visitor. As the moon climbed higher, Whimsy's thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. He turned to see a figure approaching, Reverend Blunden, his expression troubled, clutching a small leather-bound book. "Lord Peter," the vicar greeted quietly, "I hoped I might find you here. There is something you should see, something I only recently discovered among Marian Locke's possessions." Whimsy inclined his head and followed the vicar into the shadowed porch of the church, where the old wooden benches offered scant comfort but sufficient privacy. Blunden produced the book and handed it over. "A prayer book, I believe, but not an ordinary one. It contains annotations, marginal notes, fragments of Marian's thoughts, her fears and hopes, written in a hand that is sometimes steady, sometimes trembling." Whimsy leafed through the pages with deliberate care. Here were expressions of spiritual torment, references to an unseen adversary, and passages quoting scripture with unusual fervor. Yet what caught his attention most was a series of coded entries, dates paired with initials, cryptic phrases such as, "The debt must be paid and the veil must not fall." Interesting, Whimsy mused. It seems Miss Locke was keeping a secret ledger of sorts, perhaps to track events or people she feared. Blunden nodded. She confided in no one. But I suspect these notes were her attempt to wrest control from the shadows that haunted her. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden, almost imperceptible noise outside. Footsteps again, quicker this time, retreating into the night. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "We are not alone here." He stepped outside, the vicar close behind. The churchyard was deserted, but the faintest disturbance in the gravel near the gate suggested a hurried departure. "Someone watched us," Whimsy said, "or sought to ensure these revelations remained hidden." Returning inside, Whimsy set the prayer book carefully on a side table and considered the implications. The coded references to debts and veils hinted at a deeper game, one of psychological blackmail or secret obligations. He recalled the fragmentary paper with the address. Cross-referencing it with the village records, he found that the address belonged to a modest cottage on the outskirts of Great Tassington, recently vacated. "I must see this place," Whimsy said, turning to the vicar. "It may hold the final clues." The cottage was a modest, weathered building, its paint peeling and garden overgrown. It looked untouched for some days, yet the front door bore fresh scratches near the lock. Whimsy knelt to inspect and found the impression of a key. Not the family's ornate skeleton variety, but a simple latchkey. Inside, the air was stale but dry. The sitting room held little furniture: an old armchair, a rickety table, and a bookshelf crowded with well-thumbed volumes on law, psychology, and local history. On the table lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages worn but intact. Whimsy opened it with the care of a man handling priceless manuscripts. The ledger contained detailed notes, accounts of meetings, references to payments, and ominous warnings about loose ends and potential exposure. Among the entries was a name repeatedly mentioned: J. Corbett. A quick inquiry with the village registrar revealed that John Corbett was a drifter of sorts, known to have been employed briefly by the Fenchurch estate, but dismissed under mysterious circumstances. Could this be the man who fled the churchyard that evening? The dark-coated stranger? Wimsey's thoughts raced as he pieced together the implications. Corbett had access, knowledge, and motive, but to what end? As he explored further, Wimsey found a folded envelope tucked between the ledger's pages, addressed to Marian Locke. Inside was a letter, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. Marian, the truth you seek is buried not beneath stone but beneath silence. Trust no one. The debts of the past will claim us all unless we act swiftly. Tonight's meeting must not be betrayed. Wimsey's brow furrowed. A warning or a threat, written by Corbett or another? The answer, he knew, lay hidden deeper. Still, returning to the vicarage, Wimsey set about reconstructing the timeline anew, now factoring in the presence of this unknown third party, Corbett, and the secret meetings hinted at in the diary and prayer book. The late evening hours were no longer simply marked by Marian's struggle with the family estate, but complicated by the shadowy movements of an outsider with possible grudges or secrets of his own. Wimsey's mind settled on the subtle psychological forces at play, the pressure exerted by Lady Fenchurch and Grantham, the secretive correspondence, the deliberate manipulation of time and access. The layers of deception were thick, but the human motivations beneath, fear, loyalty, ambition, desperation, remained constant. He knew that the next step would require a confrontation not just with facts, but with the personalities who had shaped this tragedy. The psychological manipulation, the hidden meetings, and the spectral movements in the night all pointed to a climax in which the carefully constructed facades would crumble. As dawn threatened the horizon with pale light, Wimsey allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The shadows had parted just enough to glimpse the outlines of truth. Now the final act awaited, the unveiling of the unseen hand and the silent voice that had orchestrated the events leading to Marian Locke's untimely demise. The game was near its conclusion, and Lord Peter Wimsey was ready to call the players to account. The morning light found Great Tassington wrapped in a faint mist, the village streets still subdued, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Lord Peter Wimsey, seated by the window of the vicarage, surveyed the scene with a critical eye, his fingers idly tapping a pattern upon the worn arm of his chair. The game had reached a delicate juncture. All pieces had been laid on the board, yet the final maneuver remained elusive. He had spent the previous evening considering the manifold implications of the mysterious John Corbett, his shadowy presence in the village, his cryptic ledger, and most tellingly, the letter addressed to Marian Locke that spoke in tones of urgent warning and secret debts. The suggestion of clandestine meetings, veiled threats, and whispered promises hinted at a concealed network of relationships far more complex than the surface politeness of Great Tassington would admit. But beyond Corbett's enigma, it was the human element, the intricate psychological interplay that most engaged Wimsey's attention. Jealousy, fear, loyalty, and ambition were not abstract concepts, but active forces, animating each suspect's every move. And it was within this web of emotion and duplicity that the truth awaited discovery. The vicar entered quietly, holding their folder of papers. Lord Peter, I have compiled the statements taken thus far, arranged by timeline. Perhaps it will assist you in your deductions. Wimsey gestured to a nearby table, and soon the two were immersed in the meticulous reconstruction of events from the day Marian Locke died. It is curious, Wimsey remarked, how the small details, seemingly irrelevant when properly aligned, create a pattern as precise as a mathematical formula. The matter of the clocks, for example. The vicar nodded. The grandfather clock in the hall, the kitchen clock and the mantelpiece timepiece all bore different times when examined, though none had stopped entirely. There was an air of deliberate disturbance. Exactly so, Wimsey replied. The stopped clock in the study, frozen at 9:17 p.m., aligns suspiciously with the time of death estimated by Dr. Stokes. Yet the kitchen clock, according to the housekeeper, was nearly 10 minutes fast. This suggests that whoever manipulated the clocks intended to create confusion, or more sinisterly, to provide an alibi. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. If the kitchen clock was fast, the servant's statements about Marian's whereabouts may be more unreliable than initially thought. I must revisit those testimonies with this temporal distortion in mind. "Shall I summon them again?" the vicar inquired. "Indeed. But first, we must consider the matter of the missing silver salver. It was noted absent from the dining room the morning after the murder. An insignificant object, perhaps, yet in cases such as this, the minor irregularities often prove telling." Blunden raised an eyebrow. What would a salver signify? A token, a means of transfer, perhaps a hiding place for correspondence or a clue in its own right. Someone wished to remove evidence or conceal a message, but in doing so left a trail. The salver's absence coincides with the arrival of Corbett's mysterious letter and the secret meetings hinted at therein. The morning was consumed with revisiting the household. The cook, Mrs. Dunsby, was first, her flour-dusted apron and warm manner belying the sharp eyes beneath her spectacles. She insisted she knew nothing beyond the usual rhythms of the household, yet when questioned about the kitchen clock and the late dinner preparations, she faltered. "I suppose the clock was a little out," she admitted. "But time is of no consequence when the master's affairs are concerned." Wimsey smiled gently. "Time, Mrs. Dunsby, can be everything when it conceals a secret." There he moved to the housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, a woman of stern countenance and meticulous habits. Her denial of knowledge was firm, but less assured than before. Under gentle pressure, she acknowledged hearing muffled voices late in the evening near the library door. Voices she could not quite place. Voices? Who might they have been? She hesitated. "I could not say, my lord, but it sounded urgent and low, like an argument." The gardener, too, was questioned again, and it was from him that Wimsey gleaned the most peculiar detail. A faint smell, a mixture of lavender and something acrid, noticed near the side entrance late at night. The gardener surmised it might be a chemical or disinfectant, yet none was known to be in regular use. With these pieces in hand, Wimsey returned to the study where Marian had met her fate. The room was as he had left it, windows tightly shut, the rug neatly in place save for a slight unevenness near the fireplace. He knelt to examine the hearth. A faint ash residue suggested that the fire had been recently stirred, but the embers themselves were cold. Nearby, a small scrap of paper, barely visible beneath the rug's edge, caught his eye. It bore a single word, hastily scrawled, "Fate." Wimsey folded it carefully into his notebook. The word was not random. It echoed the cryptic references in Marian's prayer book and the ledger at the cottage. As the afternoon waned, Lord Peter summoned the local constable and laid out his observations with methodical clarity. The constable listened, skeptical but attentive as Wimsey unfolded the scenario. A deliberate manipulation of timepieces to confuse the chronology, the removal of the silver salver as a concealment, the secret meetings involving Mr. Corbett, and possibly others, the emotional tension within the household, and the scented chemical hinting at an attempt to mask or destroy evidence. He paused, allowing the weight of his deductions to settle. Marian Locke's death was not a spontaneous act of passion, nor a random misfortune. It was a carefully planned event, calculated to divert suspicion and obscure the perpetrator's identity. The question remains, who stands to gain from this elaborate deception? The constable shrugged. Lady Fenchurch's family is torn by rivalries and grievances. Many could be suspected. Wimsey smiled thinly. True, yet motives alone do not suffice. The key lies in the subtle manipulation of circumstances, the way time and space were altered to produce confusion. He glanced toward the window as twilight crept in. "I intend to observe the household tonight. A midnight vigil may reveal the final link, the person whose actions cannot be disguised by clocks or shadows." That evening, cloaked in the comforting anonymity of darkness, Wimsey positioned himself near the study window, his keen eyes tracing every movement, every flicker of light within the manor. Hours passed in silent observation. The village's nocturnal hush broken only by distant owls and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. At precisely 11 minutes past midnight, a soft creak betrayed the opening of the side door. A figure slipped into the shadows, slim, deliberate, and cautious. Wimsey recognized the gait at once, John Corbett. The man carried a small satchel and moved swiftly toward the garden shed. From his vantage, Whimsy noted the careful manner in which Corbett produced a vial from within the bag, uncorked it, and poured its contents onto a bundle of cloth. The faint, acrid smell, described by the gardener, now made perfect sense. A chemical agent intended to destroy traces of evidence or mask a scent. Whimsy's mind raced as he watched Corbett complete his task and slip back into the house through a side window, silent as a cat. But what had he sought to conceal? And why? The next morning, Whimsy presented his findings to the assembled household, his tone cool and precise. The missing salver contained correspondence, letters between Marian Locke and an unknown correspondent, revealing a plan to expose a secret that would ruin reputations and fortunes alike. He turned to Lady Fenchurch, whose composed mask was beginning to crack. Mr. Corbett's presence was no mere happenstance. He was entrusted with eliminating evidence, manipulating perceptions of time, and ensuring that certain truths remained buried. Whimsy paused, surveying the faces around him. The motive is not simply inheritance or jealousy, but a more profound desperation to control the narrative, to command the fate of those ensnared in this tragic tale. As the room fell silent, the truth hung heavy in the air, poised on the edge of revelation. Whimsy knew the final confrontation was imminent, and the final mask about to fall. The air in the drawing room had thickened to a near-solid density, as though the very walls were leaning in to catch every syllable of Lord Peter Whimsy's carefully measured exposition. Lady Fenchurch, seated rigidly in her stately chair, betrayed the faintest tremor of unease beneath her otherwise serene exterior. Around her, the assembled household, servants, relatives, the vicar and the constable, watched, with mingled curiosity and apprehension. It was in these moments, when the atmosphere bristled with impending disclosure, that the sharpest minds danced delicately on the edge of truth. Whimsy, with the faintest curl of his lips suggesting a touch of irony, began again. "You see, the fabric of this mystery is woven from threads both seen and unseen, threads that, when pulled taut, reveal the intricate pattern of intent behind Marian Locke's demise." He gestured lightly toward the silver salver, now placed on a small table beside him, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Within this modest object were hidden letters, letters that threatened to expose a network of debts, clandestine meetings, and whispered threats. The hand that removed the salver sought not merely to hide these documents, but to steer suspicion away from its author. Lady Fenchurch's gaze flickered momentarily toward the vicar, then settled back on Whimsy. "And you believe Mr. Corbett to be that author?" she inquired, her voice steadier than one might have expected. Mr. Corbett was a necessary instrument, Whimsy conceded. His role was to erase physical traces, but the true architect lies deeper in the shadows of Great Tassingdon. A murmur rippled through the room. The constable exchanged a glance with the vicar, whose expression was unreadable. Whimsy continued, "If we examine the timeline with due care, discrepancies emerge not only in the clocks, but in the very testimonies we have received, most notably the presence or absence of certain individuals at critical moments." He turned to Miss Rosamond Vane, Lady Fenchurch's niece, who sat demurely but with a faint, restless tension about her. "Miss Vane, you mentioned earlier a walk by the lake that evening. Could you specify the hour?" Rosamond hesitated. "Shortly after 8, I believe." I needed air. "And you saw no one?" Whimsy pressed. "No one," she answered, though her eyes momentarily betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Curious," Whimsy murmured, "because several witnesses place you near the library around 9, yet the library's window latch was found recently disturbed." He allowed a pause for effect. "It seems our timelines may not be as neat as we had assumed," the vicar interjected gently. "Are you suggesting Miss Vane has not been truthful?" "Not deliberately," Whimsy replied with a faint smile. "Rather, memories cloud under pressure, and social graces compel us to protect one another." "But why?" asked the constable. "Because," Whimsy said, "within this household lies a complex network of loyalties and secrets. It is not uncommon for affection, guilt, or fear to silence the truth." At this juncture, the door opened quietly, and John Corbett entered, escorted by 2 constables. His expression was wary but defiant. "Lord Peter," he said, voice taut, If I'm to be accused of such complicity, I must understand the charge. Whimsy regarded him with that peculiar blend of amusement and sternness. Mr. Corbett, your nocturnal activities suggest an intent to conceal evidence, yet you are but one player on a stage larger than you appear. Corbett's jaw tightened. I was hired to remove incriminating papers. That is all. And who employed you? Whimsy's tone sharpened slightly. Corbett hesitated. Lady Fenchurch. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Lady Fenchurch's composure faltered. I did what was necessary to protect my family's name. Necessary, Whimsy echoed, his voice low and deliberate. Your actions, madam, may have doomed an innocent woman. It was Marian who endangered us all, Lady Fenchurch retorted. Her reckless attempts to expose old debts and scandals threatened to destroy reputations built over generations. Whimsy raised a hand, silencing the rising tide of voices. Reputations, while fragile, are not worth the sacrifice of a life. It is the web of deceit that ensnares us here. He turned to the vicar. May we examine the letters found in the salver? With a nod, the vicar produced a sheaf of papers carefully preserved. Whimsy read aloud excerpts that spoke of clandestine financial arrangements, veiled threats, and a desperate attempt by Marian to negotiate her safety through exposure of others' misdeeds. As we see, Whimsy continued, Marian was no mere victim of circumstance but an active participant in a dangerous game. And the final act? The constable prompted. That, Whimsy said softly, was the result of a cruel miscalculation, an attempt to silence Marian before she could reveal too much. His gaze returned to Lady Fenchurch. You arranged for Mr. Corbett to remove the letters, knowing their content could be fatal to your family's standing. Lady Fenchurch nodded, tears glistening. I did. And the murder? Whimsy pressed. For that, Lady Fenchurch whispered, I can only say that Marian's death was a tragedy. The immediate cause remains unknown to me. But not to me, Whimsy said, eyes glittering with quiet triumph. The precise sequence of events, the tampered clocks, the muffled voices, the disturbed window, all point to one conclusion. Marian Locke was murdered by someone seeking to control the narrative through fear and silence. He turned to the household. And the person who most benefited from this silence was not Lady Fenchurch, but another, one who feared exposure and chose violence over truth. The room fell into tense silence, each person waiting for the final reveal. Whimsy's eyes settled on Miss Rosamond Vane, whose pale face had grown increasingly drawn. It was you, Miss Vane, who tampered with the clocks, who disturbed the library window, and who orchestrated the final moments to create confusion. Rosamond's lips parted in a silent gasp. Then she steadied herself. I did what I must to protect my uncle's legacy. Whimsy inclined his head. A legacy built on secrets and lies. Your desperation led you to commit murder. She rose, dignity unbroken, but eyes shining with tears. I shall accept the consequences. The constables moved to take her away, while Whimsy addressed the room once more. The truth is rarely neat or comfortable, but it is the only justice we can serve. He paused, then added with his characteristic wryness, and let us all take heed. Time like truth may be manipulated, but it cannot be wholly deceived. As the household absorbed the final reckoning, Whimsy prepared to depart. With a glance to the vicar, he offered a faint smile. Another mystery laid to rest in the English countryside, Dr. Blunden. I suspect even Shakespeare would have appreciated the theatrical irony. Outside, the morning sun broke through the lingering mist, illuminating Great Tassingdon anew, a village forever altered by the secrets now brought to light, and by the man whose keen mind had unraveled the enigma with a mixture of intellect, charm, and that indefinable touch of British understatement. The air was thinner outside the grand facade of Great Tassingdon Manor, the oppressive weight of secrets lifted at last, leaving only the faint scent of damp earth and the distant tolling of the church bell. Lord Peter Whimsy stood near the entrance, adjusting his cravat with a characteristic, almost imperceptible smirk, while Dr. Blunden, who had accompanied him throughout the ordeal, lit a cigar with a resigned but admiring sigh. It all came down, as I suspected, to the choreography of time, Whimsy mused, his voice a blend of triumph and gentle irony. One might almost believe time itself conspires against the truth, if only we allow ourselves to observe its subtle missteps. Dr. Blunden nodded, puffing contemplatively. The tampered clocks, the disturbed window latch, the missing salver, a veritable symphony of deception. Whimsy smiled. Indeed, our culprit was no crude villain, but a woman acutely aware of the stage upon which she played, capable of elegant duplicity. Miss Rosamond Vane's attempts to manipulate the household's perception through temporal confusion were clever, if ultimately flawed. They turned as the vicar approached, his expression softened by the weight of finality. Lady Fenchurch has agreed to relinquish her defences and cooperate fully. The tangled web of debts and secrets shall now be unravelled under more judicious scrutiny. "And Mr. Corbett?" Blunden inquired. "An unfortunate pawn, albeit willingly so," Whimsy replied. "His role, limited but necessary, will not be forgotten by the law." Whimsy paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the early morning mist began to disperse. "It is the human heart, Doctor, that remains the greatest mystery. Jealousy, fear, and the desire to control one's legacy are far more perilous than any Gothic shadow or spectral whisper." He turned back to the assembled household, now quietly dispersing under the vicar's benign watch. "Let us remember that justice is not merely the punishment of wrongdoing, but the illumination of truth. The woman who smiled at her own grave, it seems, did so with a tragic mixture of hope and despair. With a final arch glance at the ancient manor, Whimsy buttoned his coat and began his stroll down the gravel path. "Now, Dr. Blunden, if you'll permit me a moment's reflection on Shakespeare's measure for measure, our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good we oft might win by fearing to attempt." Blunden chuckled. "Fitting indeed, my lord." As they disappeared into the awakening countryside, the echoes of tragedy, wit, and resolution lingered, a reminder that beneath the veneer of English civility, human passions writhed as persistently as ever, awaiting the discerning eye of a man who could untangle them with nothing but logic, charm, and that quintessentially British touch of dry irony.